70,000 years ago, as the last ice age tightened its grip on our planet, something catastrophic happened. Something so devastating that it nearly erased us from existence. The human species, our ancestors, were reduced to perhaps fewer than 2,000 individuals worldwide. A genetic bottleneck so severe that it left permanent markers in our DNA. A moment when humanity balanced on the knife's edge of extinction, when our entire species almost joined the countless others that have vanished forever from this earth. Imagine standing at the rim of an ancient volcano, the ground trembling beneath your feet, the sky darkening with ash, as a supervolcano unleashes its fury. This isn't fiction. This is our story. The Toba catastrophe theory suggests that around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcanic eruption in what is now Indonesia triggered a global winter. Temperatures plummeted worldwide, ecosystems collapsed, and humanity nearly disappeared. Yet here we are, billions strong, spread across every continent, the descendants of those few survivors who endured against impossible odds. How did we survive when so many other species perished? Tonight, we explore perhaps the greatest mystery of human existence, not just how we evolved, but how we nearly didn't survive at all, and the genetic evidence that reveals just how close we came to oblivion. The scientific community remains divided. Some researchers point to genetic bottlenecks and mitochondrial DNA evidence supporting the catastrophe theory. Others question the timing, the severity, or even if it happened at all. But what if the skeptics are wrong? What if we truly did face near extinction? What would it mean for our understanding of human resilience, our place in nature, and our future on this fragile planet? Throughout this investigation, we'll rate the evidence on our evidence meter, from 0 to 3 for legendary claims, 4 to 7 for debated theories, and 8 to 10 for decoded facts, allowing you to judge for yourself the strength of each revelation. Tonight we'll explore the geological evidence of the Toba supervolcano. We'll examine the genetic markers that appear in our DNA like ancient fingerprints. We'll follow archaeological clues across continents, piecing together this puzzle. We'll hear from leading paleoclimatologists who can reconstruct ancient atmospheres, from geneticists who read the story written in our chromosomes, from archaeologists who unearth human settlements that survived the catastrophe. And we'll consider alternative theories. Perhaps multiple disasters converged. Perhaps it wasn't Toba at all, but another calamity entirely. Or perhaps the genetic bottleneck formed gradually through competition or disease. But most importantly, we'll explore what this ancient catastrophe reveals about us, about human adaptability, ingenuity, and our capacity to endure, about the shared inheritance of all people on Earth, about our common ancestry. Because if the Toba catastrophe theory is correct, then every human alive today, regardless of ethnicity, nationality, or background, descends from those same few thousand survivors. We are all, quite literally, family. As we journey through time, we'll move from the relatively familiar territory of recorded history, back through the shadows of prehistory, into a time when our species was young, vulnerable, and facing extinction. 70,000 years may seem ancient to us, but it's merely a blink in Earth's 4.5 billion-year existence. Yet in that blink, something extraordinary happened. Humanity almost vanished, then somehow survived. What does it mean that our entire species nearly disappeared? What responsibility do we bear as the descendants of those survivors? What lessons can we learn from our ancestors who persevered against impossible odds? These questions aren't merely academic. In an age of climate change, pandemic disease, and nuclear weapons, understanding how humanity nearly went extinct once before may prove vital to preventing it from happening again. So join us as we decode this ancient mystery, as we piece together the evidence for humanity's narrow escape, as we uncover what may be the greatest survival story ever told, the story of us all. Chapter 2. Premise and Stakes. Before we delve deeper, let's establish what's at stake in this investigation. If the Toba catastrophe theory is correct, it fundamentally changes how we understand human history and our place on this planet. The premise is both simple and profound. Around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcanic eruption in present-day Indonesia created a volcanic winter that devastated global ecosystems. Human populations worldwide crashed. We nearly went extinct. Geneticists estimate our species may have been reduced to between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. For context, that's fewer humans than might attend a small college basketball game. A terrifyingly small number for an entire species. This genetic bottleneck left detectable signatures in our DNA, like rings in a tree trunk recording ancient droughts. Our genes tell the story of this near-extinction event, a story written in the chromosomes of every person alive today. The stakes of understanding this event correctly cannot be overstated. If true, it means all modern humans are the descendants of a tiny group of survivors. We all share a recent common ancestry from this small population. It means human diversity nearly vanished. Languages, cultures, adaptations that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. Most were lost forever, leaving only what those few survivors carried forward. It would explain why humans show remarkably little genetic diversity compared to other primates, why we're 99.9% genetically identical to each other, why racial differences are literally skin deep, the consequence of recent adaptations. The implications extend to how we understand human psychology and behavior. Did this near-extinction event select for particular traits? Did it create evolutionary pressures that shaped what it means to be human today? Consider how it might have affected our capacity for cooperation, for empathy, for collective problem-solving. Were these the very traits that allowed our ancestors to survive while others perished? And what does it reveal about human vulnerability? Despite our technology and adaptability, despite our capacity to thrive in environments from the Arctic to the Sahara, we remain at the mercy of planetary systems. The Toba catastrophe would represent the closest our species has come to extinction during our roughly 300,000-year existence. Not the first time Earth has nearly lost a hominin species, but the closest call for Homo sapiens specifically. This matters because we face similar threats today: climate change, nuclear weapons, emerging pathogens, asteroid impacts. Understanding how we nearly disappeared once could help prevent it from happening again. If we survived such a catastrophe before, perhaps we can again, but only if we understand what happened, only if we recognize our vulnerabilities, only if we learn from that ancient crisis. Alternatively, if the Toba catastrophe theory is wrong, if no such bottleneck occurred, that's equally significant. It would mean we need different explanations for our limited genetic diversity. Different understandings of human resilience. It would raise new questions. Why do we show genetic evidence of population decline? What other factors might have shaped our evolutionary history? How did human groups survive climate fluctuations throughout prehistory? This investigation isn't merely about establishing what happened 70,000 years ago. It's about understanding who we are as a species, about decoding our collective origin story, about facing our shared vulnerability. Because regardless of whether Toba specifically caused a bottleneck, we know human populations have fluctuated dramatically throughout our history. We've faced extinction-level threats before and survived them. And that itself is remarkable, that a relatively fragile hairless primate species, without particularly sharp teeth or claws, without exceptional speed or strength, has managed to survive and thrive across the planet. How did we do it? What combination of luck, adaptability, and cooperation allowed us to endure when so many other species vanished? What does that tell us about human nature and potential? As we explore these questions, remember that our evidence meter currently places the Toba catastrophe theory at 510 in the debated range, supported by some compelling evidence, but challenged by legitimate scientific questions. Throughout our journey, we'll track how each new piece of evidence strengthens or weakens the theory. We'll follow the science where it leads. We'll present competing interpretations fairly. Because ultimately what matters isn't confirming a particular theory. What matters is understanding our true history, our actual journey as a species, how we came to be who and what we are today. So what exactly is a supervolcano, and why would it threaten our existence? Unlike typical volcanoes, supervolcanoes don't form the familiar cone-shaped mountains. They're vast calderas, often hiding in plain sight. When they erupt, they don't merely spew lava. They explode with unimaginable force, ejecting hundreds or thousands of cubic kilometers of material, enough to cover entire continents in ash, enough to block the sun worldwide. The largest supervolcanic eruption in recent geological history was Toba. It ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material. For comparison, the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption ejected less than 1 cubic kilometer. Toba's eruption was so massive that it left a crater now filled by Lake Toba, a lake 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide, a permanent scar on the face of Sumatra, visible from space. When such eruptions occur, they inject massive amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating sulfuric acid aerosols that reflect sunlight back into space, cooling the planet dramatically for years or even decades. This volcanic winter could have reduced global temperatures by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius for several years. In human terms, that's the difference between present-day New York City and present-day Montreal. A significant climate shift. For our ancestors living 74,000 years ago, without modern technology, heating, or agriculture, such cooling would have been devastating. Plants would have died. Animal populations would have collapsed. Food would have become scarce. And that's precisely what some researchers believe happened, that this volcanic winter triggered a cascade of ecological disasters, that it nearly ended the human story before it had properly begun. Chapter 3. Historical context. To understand the true significance of the Toba catastrophe, we must first place it in the broader context of human evolution. We need to understand who we were 74,000 years ago, and the world we inhabited. By this point, Homo sapiens had already been evolving for well over 200,000 years. We had emerged in Africa, developed sophisticated stone tools, mastered fire, created the first symbolic art. Our ancestors had already begun their first migrations out of Africa, spreading gradually across the Middle East and into parts of Asia, adapting to new environments, encountering other hominin species along the way. This was not yet the world of agriculture or cities or written language. This was the world of hunter-gatherers, small, mobile bands following game animals, gathering wild plants, living intimately with the natural environment. Our species shared the planet with several other types of humans. The robust Neanderthals occupied Europe and parts of Asia. The mysterious Denisovans inhabited Eastern Asia. The diminutive Homo floresiensis lived in Indonesia. It was a world of megafauna now lost to us. Woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears and cave lions, giant ground sloths and saber-toothed cats. A dangerous but protein-rich environment. Earth was in the grip of the last ice age. Vast ice sheets covered much of North America and northern Europe. Sea levels were lower, exposing land bridges between continents. The climate was cooler and drier than today. Our ancestors lived in small groups, perhaps 25 to 50 individuals. They were anatomically identical to modern humans. They had the same brain capacity, the same potential for language, art, and innovation. Yet their entire global population may have numbered only in the hundreds of thousands, a tiny fraction of our current 8 billion, scattered across Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Southern Asia. Their technology was sophisticated for its time. Stone blades and points, bone tools, wooden implements that rarely survive in the archaeological record, early composite tools combining multiple materials. They controlled fire, cooked their food, used flames for warmth, protection, and perhaps ritual. Fire would have been central to their survival, particularly in cooler regions or during harsh winters. They almost certainly had language, complex communication systems, oral traditions, cultural knowledge passed from generation to generation. Though the specifics of their languages are forever lost to us, they may have practiced early forms of spirituality. Burial of the dead suggests concepts of an afterlife, Ochre pigments hint at ritual or symbolic thinking, the foundations of what would later become religious systems. This was humanity in its adolescence, not yet dominant over the planet, still vulnerable to predators and environmental changes, still one species among many, rather than the planet's undisputed apex predator. And then, approximately 74,000 years ago, catastrophe struck. The Toba supervolcano in Sumatra erupted with apocalyptic force. It was one of the most powerful volcanic events of the past 25 million years. The eruption ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material, enough to cover all of Texas in a layer 15 feet deep. The explosion was heard thousands of miles away. The ash cloud spread across the hemisphere. Volcanic ash has been found from this eruption across India, the Indian Ocean, and into the South China Sea. In some locations, the ash layer is more than 15 centimeters thick, deposited thousands of kilometers from the volcano. The ash would have blocked sunlight, triggering the volcanic winter we discussed earlier. Global temperatures would have plummeted. Ecosystems worldwide would have been severely stressed or collapsed entirely. For human populations already living on the margins of survival, already facing the challenges of an ice age, this additional stress may have been catastrophic. It may have pushed many groups beyond their capacity to adapt. Archaeological evidence suggests human activity in India diminished significantly after the Toba eruption. Stone tools become scarce in the layers immediately above the Toba ash deposits, suggesting population decline or displacement. In Eastern Africa, some research indicates a shift in stone tool technology around this time, possibly reflecting adaptation to new environmental pressures, or perhaps the innovation of desperate survivors. The genetic evidence is particularly compelling. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA passed directly from mother to child suggests a population bottleneck around this time, a moment when our genetic diversity narrowed dramatically. Some geneticists estimate the effective breeding population may have dropped to as few as 1,000, 10,000 individuals, not necessarily the total population, but those who successfully reproduced and passed on their genes. The timing aligns suspiciously well with the Toba eruption, though as we'll see, this timeline is disputed by some researchers who place the bottleneck earlier or question whether it happened at all. If accurate, this would mean that all 8 billion humans alive today descended from this small group of survivors. We would all trace our lineage back to these few thousand individuals who endured through the catastrophe. Think about what this means. The genetic differences between any two humans on Earth, regardless of ethnicity or appearance, are minimal precisely because we all share this recent common ancestry. The diversity of our species was nearly extinguished. What remained was a fraction of our previous genetic variation, a narrow sampling that would form the foundation for all future human populations. And yet, remarkably, we survived. Not only survived, but thrived. Recovered from this bottleneck to eventually populate every corner of the planet, to become the dominant species on Earth. What saved us? Was it our technology? Our capacity for cooperation? Our ability to adapt to changing conditions? Or simply luck? Being in the right places when disaster struck? These are the questions we'll explore as we continue our investigation, as we examine the evidence for and against the Toba catastrophe theory, as we decode the mystery of humanity's narrow escape. Let's examine the first crucial evidence supporting the Toba catastrophe theory. The geological record is clear. The eruption itself is indisputable. The ash layers have been precisely dated to approximately 74,000 years ago. Lake Toba in Sumatra sits within the caldera created by this eruption, a vast crater 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide, one of the largest volcanic features on Earth. Visible evidence of ancient cataclysm. The magnitude of the eruption is measured on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, VEI. Toba registers as an 8 on this scale. The maximum possible rating, an ultra-Plinian eruption of extraordinary force. To put this in perspective, the famous 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption rated a VEI 5. Toba was approximately 100 times more powerful, ejecting nearly 3,000 times more material into the atmosphere. The ashfall covered enormous areas. Deposits have been found across South Asia, in the Indian Ocean, and as far away as the South China Sea and East Africa, a truly global event. Chemical analysis of these ash deposits confirms they originated from Toba. The unique geochemical signature of the volcano is unmistakable, allowing scientists to track its distribution with precision. This widespread ash would have had immediate devastating effects. Areas near the volcano would have been obliterated. Regions across South Asia would have experienced ash deposits thick enough to collapse structures. But the most significant impact came from what scientists call volcanic winter, when sulfur dioxide from the eruption combined with water in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid aerosols, creating a haze that reflected sunlight. Ice cores from Greenland reveal a significant sulfate spike corresponding to this period, evidence of global atmospheric changes, indicators of a dramatic cooling event that may have lasted years or even decades. Climate models suggest global temperatures may have dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius for several years following the eruption, with some regions experiencing even more dramatic cooling, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. For context, the Little Ice Age that affected Europe from roughly 1300 to 1850 CE involved average temperature drops of just 1–2 to 2 degrees Celsius, yet it caused crop failures, famines, and significant social disruption. The cooling after Toba would have been significantly worse. And unlike modern humans, our ancestors lacked agricultural surpluses, complex transportation networks, or technological buffers against environmental stress. This brings us to the second line of evidence, the genetic data. Our DNA contains markers of ancient population events. Like tree rings recording droughts or floods, our genes record expansions and contractions. Mitochondrial DNA is particularly useful for tracking population history. Unlike nuclear DNA, it passes unchanged from mother to child, accumulating mutations at a relatively constant rate over time. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA diversity reveals something remarkable. All humans alive today show surprisingly low genetic diversity, far less variation than we see in other great apes, despite our much larger population. This limited genetic diversity suggests a population bottleneck, a period when our numbers declined dramatically, when much of our genetic variation was lost, leaving only a fraction of our previous diversity. Using molecular clock techniques, geneticists have attempted to date this bottleneck. Many estimates place it roughly 70,000 years ago, suspiciously close to the timing of the Toba supervolcanic eruption. From this genetic evidence, researchers have estimated the effective female population may have dropped to perhaps fewer than 2,000 individuals, a perilously small number for an entire species. The third line of evidence comes from archaeology. Stone tools found in India show an intriguing pattern. Tools are abundant below the Toba ash layer, but become scarce immediately above it, suggesting population decline. At sites like Jwalapuram in southern India, archaeologists have uncovered sophisticated stone tools directly below the Toba ash layer, evidence of thriving human populations immediately before the catastrophe. The pattern of human expansion out of Africa also shows an interesting timeline. Genetic studies suggest a major dispersal of Homo sapiens from Africa into Asia occurred roughly 60,000, 70,000 years ago, after the bottleneck. This timing suggests the possibility that survivors of the catastrophe, having endured extreme selection pressure, may have developed new adaptations or technologies, allowing them to expand successfully into new territories. Or perhaps the catastrophe so depleted human populations that it created ecological opportunities, open niches that recovering human groups could exploit. Driving expansion after the bottleneck, computer simulations of ancient climate conditions further support the theory. Models show that following an eruption of Toba's magnitude, global cooling would have been severe enough to significantly impact human populations. These simulations indicate particularly harsh conditions in the Northern Hemisphere, with growing seasons shortened or eliminated entirely, with dramatic reductions in plant growth and ecosystem productivity. For hunter-gatherer populations dependent on predictable plant and animal resources, such disruptions would have been catastrophic, potentially pushing many groups beyond their capacity to adapt. Yet the evidence isn't without contradictions. Some archaeological sites show continuous human occupation through the Toba time period, without the expected gap in habitation that a catastrophe might create. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, for instance, researchers have found evidence of consistent human activity before, during, and after the Toba eruption, suggesting at least some populations were minimally affected. Similarly, sites in East Africa show technological continuity through this period. The same tool-making traditions persist. Without the dramatic changes we might expect from a near-extinction event, some genetic studies challenge the timing of the bottleneck, placing it earlier in human evolution, or suggesting multiple smaller bottlenecks rather than a single catastrophic event. The debate intensified when researchers examined lake cores from East Africa, looking for evidence of dramatic cooling or ecological disruption, but finding less severe climate changes than expected. This suggests the possibility that Toba's impact may have been regionally variable, perhaps devastating in some areas while leaving others relatively untouched, creating a patchwork of disaster rather than global catastrophe. But here's where the mystery deepens. If Toba wasn't responsible for the genetic bottleneck, what was? What else could have reduced human populations so dramatically around this time? Could it have been a combination of factors? The Toba eruption coinciding with the already challenging conditions of the Ice Age, multiple stressors converging to push human populations to the brink? Or perhaps Toba was just one of several catastrophes. Maybe disease swept through human populations, or competition with other hominin species intensified, or meteorite impacts added to the stress. As we stand at this point in our investigation, the evidence for the Toba catastrophe theory remains compelling but incomplete. Our evidence meter reads 610, in the debated range, supported by significant evidence but with important questions unresolved. The geological evidence for the eruption itself is incontrovertible. The genetic evidence for a bottleneck is strong, but the direct causal link between these two events remains circumstantial, which brings us to perhaps the most fascinating question of all. If humanity truly did nearly go extinct 74,000 years ago, if we were reduced to a few thousand individuals, how did we survive? What combination of luck, adaptability, and innovation allowed some groups to endure while others perished? What traits were selected for during this evolutionary crucible? How did it shape what it means to be human? Because something extraordinary happened after this bottleneck. Within a relatively short evolutionary time frame, humans not only recovered, but underwent a creative explosion. A period of unprecedented innovation. The archaeological record shows increasingly sophisticated tools, more complex social organizations, the spread of symbolic thinking and art, the foundations of what would eventually become modern human culture. Did the catastrophe itself somehow spark this innovation? Did it select for traits like creativity, cooperation, and adaptability? Did surviving the bottleneck fundamentally change our species? And most disturbingly, what does this ancient catastrophe tell us about our future? As we face modern existential threats like climate change, nuclear weapons, and emerging pathogens, what lessons can we learn from our ancestors who survived? These questions grow more urgent as we uncover more evidence, as we recognize that humanity's continued existence was never guaranteed, that our dominance on this planet is more precarious than we often assume. In the next section, we'll explore competing theories about the bottleneck. We'll examine the archaeological evidence from around the world, and we'll investigate how some human populations may have survived when others didn't. Because the story of Toba isn't just about an ancient catastrophe, it's about who we are, about our shared vulnerability and resilience, about the common ancestry that unites every human on Earth. Chapter 5. Contradictions and anomalies. As compelling as the Toba catastrophe theory may be, it's not without significant contradictions. The evidence isn't as straightforward as it first appears, and recent discoveries have challenged some of its fundamental assumptions. Let's begin with perhaps the most significant challenge: the timing. While genetic studies initially suggested a bottleneck around 70,000 years ago, newer research indicates multiple bottlenecks throughout human prehistory, not just one. A 2018 study published in PNAS analyzed genomic data from diverse human populations and found evidence for a much earlier bottleneck, perhaps 100,000 to 150,000 years ago, well before the Toba eruption. This earlier timing aligns with a period of extreme climate fluctuation during the Middle Pleistocene, when severe drought conditions affected much of Africa, potentially causing the first major contraction of human populations. If accurate, this would decouple the genetic bottleneck from Toba entirely, suggesting our near extinction predated the supervolcano by tens of thousands of years, a significant challenge to the theory. Then there's the archaeological evidence from Africa. At sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa, researchers have found continuous human occupation through the Toba time period, without any evident disruption. The stone tools, food remains, and other artifacts show remarkable consistency before and after the Toba timeframe. No dramatic changes in technology or subsistence strategies, no signs of population collapse or recovery. Similar continuity has been documented at sites across Eastern Africa, the very region where we believe the core human population survived, showing little evidence of the catastrophic disruption that Toba should have caused. More puzzling still are recent findings from Lake Malawi in Africa. Scientists extracted sediment cores spanning the last 100,000 years, looking for evidence of dramatic cooling or ecological disruption following Toba. What they found contradicted expectations. The cores showed remarkably stable temperatures and vegetation patterns through the Toba time period. Without the dramatic cooling or ecosystem collapse, the theory predicts. This suggests that at least in Eastern Africa, humanity's evolutionary cradle, the Toba eruption may have had minimal impact. The volcanic winter may not have been as severe or as global as initially thought. Archaeological sites in India present another anomaly. At Jwalapuram in southern India, stone tools have been found both below and immediately above the Toba ash layer, with minimal changes in technology or abundance. This is particularly surprising given India's proximity to Toba. If anywhere should show evidence of catastrophic disruption, it would be South Asia. Yet human occupation appears to have continued largely uninterrupted. Recent climatic modeling has also raised questions. Modern supercomputer simulations suggest Toba's impact may have been less severe than earlier models indicated, with cooling perhaps lasting only a few years rather than decades. These models suggest that while some regions would have experienced dramatic cooling, others may have been relatively unaffected, creating a patchwork of impact rather than global catastrophe. A more nuanced picture. Additionally, marine sediment cores from the Arabian Sea show less sulfur deposition than expected from a global cooling event, suggesting Toba's atmospheric impact may have been more limited than previously thought. Even the genetic evidence itself has come under scrutiny. Some researchers argue that the apparent bottleneck might reflect selection effects rather than population decline, positive selection for certain genes, creating an illusion of narrowed diversity. Others point out that genetic dating techniques rely on assumptions about mutation rates that could be flawed. Even small errors in these rates could significantly shift the estimated timing of population events. When we examine Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, we find no evidence of a corresponding bottleneck. If Toba truly caused a global volcanic winter, shouldn't it have affected all hominin species, not just Homo sapiens? This raises a troubling possibility. Perhaps we're seeing not the aftermath of a volcanic catastrophe, but evidence of competition between hominin species. Perhaps we nearly went extinct due to conflict rather than climate. Or maybe disease played a role, a pandemic pathogen that affected Homo sapiens but not other hominins, a prehistoric plague that decimated our ancestors while leaving our evolutionary cousins untouched. These contradictions don't necessarily invalidate the Toba catastrophe theory entirely, but they do complicate it. They suggest a more complex story than simply volcano erupts, humans nearly die out. Even more perplexing are the anomalies, evidence that doesn't fit neatly into any current theory, findings that challenge our understanding not just of Toba, but of human evolution more broadly. For instance, recent genetic studies have identified traces of a mysterious ghost population in modern human DNA, evidence of interbreeding with an unknown hominin group around the time of the supposed bottleneck. Who were these mysterious humans? How did they survive if Toba was truly catastrophic? And how did our ancestors encounter them if human populations were reduced to isolated refugia? The timing of human dispersal out of Africa presents another anomaly. Recent discoveries in places like Israel, Saudi Arabia, and China suggest humans may have left Africa much earlier than previously thought. Stone tools found in China have been dated to 80,000, 120,000 years ago, well before the Toba eruption, suggesting human populations were already widespread across Asia when Toba erupted. If true, this would mean the bottleneck, if it happened, affected not just African populations, but already dispersed groups across southern Asia, making the survival of any human groups even more remarkable. Then there's the curious pattern of technological innovation following the supposed bottleneck. Around 50,000, 40,000 years ago, we see an explosion of sophisticated technology, art, and symbolic behavior. This creative explosion coincides suspiciously with the recovery period after the proposed bottleneck, as if the catastrophe somehow accelerated human cognitive and cultural evolution. An unexpected outcome. Could extreme evolutionary pressure have selected for enhanced cognitive traits? Could the demands of surviving in post-catastrophe environments have favored greater innovation and cooperation? A fascinating possibility. Or perhaps the timing is coincidental. Perhaps the creative explosion was already underway, driven by other factors, and the apparent connection to Toba is merely an artifact of our limited archaeological record. Some anthropologists have suggested an intriguing alternative. Perhaps genetic mutations affecting brain development and function were already present before Toba, but only became widespread afterward due to population dynamics. In this scenario, the bottleneck didn't cause the mutations, but accelerated their spread through the reduced population, a founder effect that transformed our cognitive capabilities, changing the course of human evolution. The distribution of Y chromosome haplogroups adds another layer of complexity. Certain paternal lineages show patterns of dispersal that don't align neatly with the Toba timeframe, suggesting multiple dispersal events rather than a single post-catastrophe expansion. Similarly, studies of linguistic diversity suggest a more complex pattern of human movement and population separation than the simple bottleneck model would predict. Languages diversified in ways that don't match a single near-extinction event. Even more puzzling is evidence from ancient DNA. Analysis of specimens predating Toba shows genetic diversity patterns that don't differ dramatically from later populations, challenging the notion of a severe genetic bottleneck. As our evidence meter indicates, we remain in the debated range at 510. The contradictions and anomalies don't disprove the Toba catastrophe theory, but they do require us to refine it, to develop a more nuanced understanding. Perhaps it wasn't Toba alone, but a combination of factors. Perhaps different human populations were affected to different degrees. Perhaps the timing of the bottleneck and the eruption are coincidental rather than causal. Or perhaps we're looking at multiple bottlenecks throughout human prehistory. Not one near-extinction event, but several, each shaping our genetic heritage, our capabilities, and our destiny as a species. What remains clear is that something extraordinary happened in our evolutionary past, something that left permanent markers in our DNA, something that nearly erased humanity from the earth. But what exactly that was remains an open question. As we continue our investigation, we'll need to look beyond conventional evidence, to consider sources often overlooked by traditional science, including the myths and legends that might preserve ancient memories of catastrophe. For the story of humanity's narrow escape may be recorded not just in ash layers and DNA, but in the collective memory of our species, in stories passed down through countless generations, in the shared nightmares of our ancestors. Chapter 6. Myths and out-of-place evidence. Could the memory of catastrophe be preserved in our oldest stories? Do myths around the world contain echoes of actual events from deep prehistory? Could humanity's collective memory extend back 70,000 years? These questions might seem far-fetched. Our evidence meter drops to 310, firmly in the legendary range. Yet the prevalence of certain mythic themes across cultures separated by vast distances and times is striking. Flood myths are perhaps the most universal. From the biblical account of Noah to the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, from Hindu texts describing the Matsya avatar to indigenous Australian Dreamtime stories, nearly every culture on Earth preserves some account of a great flood that nearly destroyed humanity, a catastrophe from which only a small number of people survived, often taking shelter on mountains or in caves. While these are typically interpreted as regional flood events or purely symbolic narratives, could they instead preserve a distorted memory of the aftermath of Toba, when acid rain and melting ice sheets may have caused widespread flooding? Similarly, myths of a dark time or period of extended night appear across cultures. Stories of when the sun disappeared or dimmed, when darkness covered the world, when cold and famine threatened all life. In Norse mythology, Fimbulwinter, the great winter that precedes Ragnarok, describes 3 successive winters without summer in between. A volcanic winter in mythological form? Perhaps. Hindu texts speak of pralaya, periodic dissolutions of the world, times when the cosmos is destroyed before being recreated, often associated with both fire and flood, reminiscent of volcanic catastrophe. Indigenous Australian traditions describe a time when the sky fell down, when ash covered the land, when the ancestral beings had to recreate the world, potentially preserving memories from the deepest human past. Many African cultures preserve stories of a time when the world grew cold and dark, when food became scarce, when only the most resourceful people survived. Themes that align suspiciously well with the Toba scenario. The Chinese legend of Nuwa repairing the Pillar of Heaven describes a catastrophe where the heavens collapsed, the earth split open, and fire blazed out of control. Language evocative of massive volcanic eruption. Even the biblical concept of Eden might be interpreted as a memory of the pre-catastrophe world, a lost paradise from which humans were expelled, forced to struggle in a harsher, post-disaster environment. Mythology experts like Joseph Campbell noted striking similarities between apocalyptic myths worldwide, common elements that transcend cultural boundaries, potentially indicating shared origins in actual events. Could oral traditions really preserve memories over such vast timeframes? Most scholars would say no. Yet indigenous Australian stories have been shown to accurately describe coastal flooding from the end of the last ice age. Those flood events occurred 10,000, 13,000 years ago, suggesting that accurate oral transmission can indeed span many millennia. Though 70,000 years would be unprecedented, the transmission mechanism might involve more than just stories. Ritual reenactments, sacred sites, symbolic art. Multiple reinforcing systems that preserved essential information about world-changing events. More intriguing still are the out-of-place archaeological finds, evidence that doesn't fit neatly into our understanding of human technological development, artifacts that suggest capabilities beyond what we believe possible for their time. Stone tools found at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to approximately 315,000 years ago, show surprisingly sophisticated techniques, much earlier than expected for such advanced technology, suggesting our timeline might be wrong. Similarly, recent discoveries at Blombos Cave in South Africa revealed ochre processing tools, engraved patterns, and shell beads dating to 100,000, 75,000 years ago. Evidence of symbolic thinking long before the supposed creative explosion. These findings challenge the notion that cognitive modernity emerged only after the Toba bottleneck, suggesting instead that human capabilities developed more gradually, with the apparent explosion potentially representing preservation bias. Even more puzzling are the ghost populations mentioned earlier, genetic evidence of unknown hominin groups that interbred with our ancestors, groups that left no clear fossil record yet contributed to our genome. One such population appears to have diverged from our lineage around 700,000 years ago, yet somehow survived to interbreed with Homo sapiens around 50,000 years ago. How did they endure when we nearly didn't? Did these mysterious hominins possess adaptations or technologies that helped them survive the Toba catastrophe? Did interbreeding with them contribute to our post-bottleneck recovery and expansion? Fascinating questions. Then there are the curious patterns in human genetic diversity. Certain populations show unexpected mutations or adaptations, genetic variations that emerged suspiciously close to the Toba timeframe. For instance, genetic studies of Tibetan highlanders reveal adaptations for high-altitude living that may have emerged around 50,000, 30,000 years ago, shortly after the supposed bottleneck, a remarkably rapid adaptation. Similarly, genetic resistance to certain diseases appears to have spread widely in the post-Toba period, as if survivors had developed or already possessed immunological advantages. Another potential factor in their survival. Even more curious is the distribution of certain beneficial mutations, genetic variations that spread so rapidly they suggest either extraordinary selection pressure or population dynamics consistent with a severe bottleneck. These include genes related to brain development, immune function, and metabolism, critical systems that might have given their bearers survival advantages during and after a catastrophe, potential keys to our narrow escape. Archaeological evidence also contains anomalies, sites with sophisticated artifacts appearing suddenly, without clear precursors, technological leaps that defy conventional explanations of gradual development. For example, the sudden appearance of complex projectile technology around 40,000, 30,000 years ago, representing a significant advancement over previous hunting methods, emerging with suspicious timing after the supposed bottleneck. Similarly, sophisticated art appears almost simultaneously across widely separated regions, as if a common cognitive capability suddenly expressed itself globally. An unexpected pattern that demands explanation. The most famous examples are the cave paintings of Europe, but similar artistic traditions emerged in Indonesia, Australia, and Africa around the same time period. A global phenomenon rather than a regional development. Could this represent the genetic spread of cognitive mutations that survived the bottleneck? Or perhaps the transmission of cultural innovations developed under extreme survival pressure? The timing is certainly suggestive. Equally puzzling is the evidence for long-distance trade networks that emerged in the post-Toba period. Materials transported hundreds or even thousands of kilometers, suggesting complex social organizations and navigation abilities. Marine shells found at inland sites, distinctive stone types far from their sources, ochre pigments traded across vast territories, evidence of connections between groups that should have been isolated according to conventional models. These trade networks appear more extensive and sophisticated than previously thought possible for this time period, suggesting our ancestors possessed greater organizational and navigational capabilities than we've assumed. Could these capabilities have developed as adaptation to post-catastrophe conditions? Did the demands of survival in a devastated landscape drive innovations in social organization and resource acquisition? Another intriguing possibility. Climate records themselves present anomalies, periods of rapid warming and cooling that don't align with known orbital or solar forcing mechanisms, climate shifts that might indicate volcanic or impact events not yet identified. Ice cores from Greenland show mysterious sulfate spikes around the Toba timeframe, but also at other periods, suggesting multiple volcanic events might have affected human evolution, not just one supervolcano. Lake sediments from East Africa show evidence of repeated drought cycles, periods of extreme aridity that would have stressed human populations, potentially creating multiple bottlenecks throughout our evolutionary history. Marine sediment cores reveal unusual patterns of dust deposition during this period, potentially indicating atmospheric disturbances beyond what Toba alone could cause, perhaps suggesting additional factors in the catastrophe scenario. Even the geographical distribution of human genetic diversity contains puzzles. Certain isolated populations show unexpected relationships to distant groups, genetic connections that don't match conventional migration models. The San people of southern Africa, for instance, preserve some of humanity's oldest genetic lineages, yet also show unexpected connections to populations in East Asia, a pattern difficult to explain without invoking complex migration histories. Similarly, isolated groups like the Andamanese Islanders preserve genetic signatures that don't fit neatly into standard models of human dispersal, suggesting our spread across the planet was more complex than previously thought. Australian Aboriginal genomes contain evidence of an early migration wave predating the post-Toba expansion, people who somehow reached that isolated continent before the supposed bottleneck. Another challenge to the simple model. These myths and anomalies don't provide definitive evidence for the Toba catastrophe theory. Hence, our evidence meter remains in the legendary range. But they do suggest our understanding of human prehistory remains incomplete. They hint at a more complex story, a narrative of multiple challenges, adaptations, and near extinctions, a history where our ancestors faced not just one catastrophe but many, yet somehow survived them all. Perhaps most significantly, they remind us that conventional evidence, ash layers, DNA, stone tools, may tell only part of the story. That humanity's collective memory, preserved in myth and ritual, might contain truths science is only beginning to rediscover. As we continue our investigation, we must hold these contradictions, anomalies, and legends in mind, not as definitive answers, but as questions challenging us to dig deeper, to look beyond the conventional narrative, because the true story of humanity's narrow escape, or escapes, may be far stranger, more complex, and more fascinating than we've yet imagined. A story whose full revelation could transform our understanding of who we are. Chapter 7. Stakes Escalation. As we've seen, the evidence for the Toba catastrophe theory is contradictory, intriguing but incomplete, suggesting a complex reality beyond our current understanding. But regardless of whether Toba specifically caused a bottleneck, the stakes of this investigation couldn't be higher, because something nearly erased our species from existence. Something reduced our ancestors to a perilously small population. Something shaped our genetic heritage, our cognitive evolution, and our destiny as a species. Understanding what that something was, and how our ancestors survived it, might be crucial to our continued existence. For we now face new existential threats of our own making, challenges that could once again reduce us to a remnant population or eliminate us entirely. Climate change threatens to disrupt the stable environmental conditions that enabled civilization to develop. Nuclear weapons could trigger a nuclear winter, comparable to or worse than any volcanic winter. Engineered pandemics could spread faster and prove deadlier than anything in history. Artificial intelligence presents unprecedented possibilities and dangers. Ecological collapse threatens the life support systems we depend upon. Resource depletion challenges our consumption-based economies and lifestyles. In facing these modern threats, we might find crucial lessons in how our ancestors survived past catastrophes. What strategies, technologies, adaptations, and social structures enabled them to endure when extinction seemed certain. Recent research suggests one key factor may have been social cohesion, the ability to maintain cooperative groups under extreme stress, to share resources, knowledge, and labor when every instinct might push toward selfishness. Archaeological evidence from the period following the supposed bottleneck shows increasing evidence of trade networks, shared symbolic systems, and cooperative hunting techniques, signs of enhanced social organization. This raises a provocative possibility. Could catastrophe have selected for pro-social traits? Could the survivors have been those who maintained group cohesion rather than fragmenting into individuals? Could cooperation itself be an adaptation to disaster? Genetic studies lend some support to this idea. Certain genes associated with empathy, altruism, and social bonding show evidence of positive selection in the period following the supposed bottleneck, suggesting these traits offered survival advantages. If true, this would mean our capacity for cooperation, perhaps humanity's most distinctive characteristic, was forged in the crucible of near extinction, that we are, in a very real sense, the descendants of those who chose to work together rather than alone. Another critical factor appears to have been technological adaptability, the capacity to innovate new tools, strategies, and lifeways in response to rapidly changing conditions, to solve novel problems with creative solutions. The archaeological record shows significant technological innovation following the supposed bottleneck. New hunting technologies, new shelter designs, new food processing methods, adaptations to environments previously uninhabitable by humans. This technological flourishing suggests either that catastrophe selected for greater cognitive flexibility, or that the demographic changes following population collapse created opportunities for innovation to spread more rapidly. Either way, it suggests that adaptability, not specialization, was key to our ancestors' survival, that those who could reimagine their relationship with their environment were those who lived to reproduce. A lesson with obvious relevance today. A third factor may have been geographical dispersal, the distribution of human populations across diverse environments, ensuring that no single catastrophe, however severe, could eliminate everyone simultaneously. Genetic evidence suggests our ancestors maintained small, widely dispersed populations, from tropical Africa to temperate Eurasia, from coastal environments to inland highlands, a distribution that created resilience through diversity. When disaster struck one region, populations elsewhere could survive. When resources became scarce in one area, people could move to another. When one adaptation failed, others might succeed. A strategy of not keeping all humans in one basket. This distributed resilience stands in stark contrast to our modern concentration in vulnerable cities, our dependence on fragile supply chains, our monoculture agriculture, our interconnected financial systems that can transmit shocks globally. Have we unwittingly engineered a world more vulnerable to catastrophe than that of our ancient ancestors? Have we sacrificed resilience for efficiency? Have we forgotten the very strategies that allowed our species to survive? These questions gain urgency when we consider the patterns of previous mass extinctions. Earth has experienced 5 major extinction events before the current anthropogenic one, each with different causes but similar results. The end Permian extinction, 252 million years ago, the most severe, eliminated approximately 96% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. A near-total reset of Earth's biosphere, likely caused by massive volcanic eruptions in Siberia. The KPG extinction 66 million years ago, famous for killing the dinosaurs, eliminated about 75% of species, triggered by an asteroid impact and possibly exacerbated by volcanic activity. Another planetary catastrophe. These events remind us that Earth has experienced and will again experience catastrophes far beyond anything in recorded human history. That the stability of the Holocene epoch, the past 11,700 years during which civilization developed, is the exception, not the rule. And they suggest that our species' near extinction 70,000 years ago may not have been a unique event, that existential threats may be more common than we like to imagine, that our continued existence requires constant vigilance. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing implication of the Toba catastrophe theory, the concept of the great filter in the Fermi paradox, the idea that something prevents technological civilizations from becoming common in the universe. The paradox arises from the contradiction between the apparent likelihood of extraterrestrial intelligence and our lack of evidence for it. Given the billions of potentially habitable planets in our galaxy alone, where is everyone? One possible answer is that some filter prevents most life from reaching or maintaining technological civilization. Either most planets never develop complex life, or most complex life never develops intelligence. or most intelligent life destroys itself before expanding into space. If catastrophes like Toba are common, if most intelligent species face extinction-level threats before developing sufficient technology to mitigate them, then perhaps we've identified one potential great filter, a gauntlet that few species survive. The chilling possibility is that we haven't passed all the filters yet, that the same pattern that nearly eliminated us 70,000 years ago could recur. That technological civilization might itself create extinction pressures few species overcome. This perspective transforms our investigation from mere historical curiosity to urgent existential inquiry. Understanding how we survived past catastrophes might be essential to navigating future ones, to avoiding the fate that perhaps befalls most intelligent life. Recent developments in modeling past climate events have revealed something even more concerning: the possibility that Earth's climate system contains tipping points, thresholds beyond which rapid, irreversible changes occur, changes that could render large regions uninhabitable. Evidence suggests our planet has experienced such rapid transitions before, periods when global temperatures shifted by 5 to 10 degrees Celsius within decades rather than millennia, when sea levels rose meters within human lifetimes, when established ecosystems collapsed almost overnight. Could Toba have triggered such a tipping point? Could our ancestors have witnessed and somehow survived a rapid climate transition? If so, how? And what does that tell us about our own precarious position? Because we are now pushing on those same planetary boundaries, increasing atmospheric CO2 at rates unprecedented in geological history, reducing biodiversity faster than during most mass extinctions, altering nitrogen and phosphorus cycles fundamental to life. Are we unwittingly recreating the conditions that nearly eliminated us once before? Are we triggering changes that will once again reduce humanity to a remnant population? Will our descendants, if any, tell myths about our hubris? The most recent climate modeling suggests something truly alarming: that multiple planetary systems are approaching potential tipping points simultaneously. That changes in one system could cascade into others, creating compound effects beyond anything in human experience. The melting of Arctic sea ice reduces Earth's albedo, accelerating warming. Thawing permafrost releases methane, a potent greenhouse gas. Dying forests transform from carbon sinks to carbon sources. Warming oceans lose oxygen and release stored CO2. These interconnected processes create the potential for non-linear accelerating change, for climate shifts occurring faster than adaptation can accommodate, for disruptions that could overwhelm even our modern technological capacity to respond. If our pre-technological ancestors faced and somehow survived similar rapid transitions, understanding how they did so becomes not just academically interesting, but potentially crucial knowledge. A blueprint for survival in chaotic planetary conditions. This may explain why certain human adaptations spread so rapidly after the supposed bottleneck, why cognitive capabilities for flexible problem-solving, cooperation, and innovation became dominant. They weren't merely beneficial, they were essential for survival. It may also explain the curious pattern of accelerating technological development that defines human history. Perhaps we've been unknowingly engaged in an evolutionary arms race against planetary instability, developing increasingly powerful tools to buffer ourselves against environmental threats. From this perspective, technology itself might be understood as an adaptive response to catastrophe, a means of creating stability in an inherently unstable system, a buffer against the very forces that nearly eliminated us. Yet ironically, our technological success has now created new instabilities, new threats perhaps greater than those our ancestors faced, challenges that require not just technological solutions, but wisdom our species has yet to demonstrate. This is the ultimate stake of our investigation, not just understanding our past, but securing our future, not just satisfying historical curiosity, but identifying the adaptations, technological, social, and cognitive, that might allow us to survive the challenges ahead. Because if the Toba catastrophe theory is correct, if humanity truly did nearly vanish once before, then our existence has never been guaranteed. Our dominance on this planet has always been precarious. Our future remains uncertain. As we enter the final phase of our investigation, we'll examine the most recent scientific evidence about the bottleneck. We'll consider what it reveals about human resilience and vulnerability. We'll explore what it might tell us about navigating our uncertain future. And perhaps most importantly, we'll ask what it means that all of us, all 8 billion humans on Earth today, are the descendants of those few individuals who somehow survived when extinction seemed certain. What responsibility we bear as the inheritors of their extraordinary resilience, for in understanding how close we came to never existing at all, we might find the wisdom and humility necessary to ensure our continued existence, to honor the struggle of our ancestors by securing the future of our descendants, to truly decode the meaning of our narrow escape. Chapter 8. Competing Theories. As we've seen, the Toba catastrophe theory offers a compelling but incomplete explanation for humanity's genetic bottleneck. But it's not the only possibility. Several competing theories might explain the same evidence while avoiding the contradictions we've encountered. The first major alternative is the multiple bottleneck theory. Rather than one catastrophic event, this model proposes several smaller population contractions throughout human prehistory, each reducing our genetic diversity incrementally rather than all at once. This theory aligns better with recent genetic analyses, suggesting bottlenecks at different time periods, including one around 150,000 years ago during an extreme glacial period, another approximately 50,000 years ago, coinciding with human dispersal from Africa. It also resolves the contradiction of continuous human occupation at sites like Pinnacle Point. If population reductions were regional rather than global, if different human groups experienced bottlenecks at different times, the archaeological record would show precisely the pattern we observe. Computer simulations support this possibility. Models of human population dynamics under changing climate conditions show repeated expansions and contractions, boom and bust cycles driven by environmental fluctuations, rather than a single catastrophic collapse. These simulations align with paleoclimate records showing dramatic climate oscillations throughout the Pleistocene, rapid warming and cooling events, shifting rainfall patterns, expanding and contracting habitable zones, creating a constantly changing selective landscape. Under such conditions, human populations would naturally experience repeated bottlenecks and expansions, with genetic diversity gradually narrowing over time, as successive environmental filters eliminated certain lineages while preserving others. This multiple bottleneck theory stands at 710 on our evidence meter, slightly higher than Toba alone. Its strength lies in better explaining the timing discrepancies in genetic and archaeological evidence, while still acknowledging that humanity faced severe challenges. The second major alternative is the competitive replacement theory. This proposes that the apparent bottleneck reflects not environmental catastrophe, but competition between human populations, perhaps even warfare or disease transmission between groups. As early humans dispersed from Africa, they would have encountered diverse environments and challenges. Different groups would have developed different adaptations and technologies, creating a mosaic of populations with varying competitive advantages. When these groups later came into contact, perhaps during climate-driven migrations, the more adaptable or technologically advanced populations may have displaced others, either through direct conflict, resource competition, or transmission of novel pathogens. This process would create a genetic signature similar to a bottleneck, as certain lineages expanded while others disappeared, as successful adaptations spread through the population while others were lost, as humanity's genetic diversity narrowed through selection rather than disaster. Archaeological evidence provides some support for this theory. The transition from Neanderthals to modern humans in Europe shows exactly this pattern of replacement, as does the disappearance of Denisovans in Asia, and potentially other hominin species elsewhere. Recent genetic studies have identified genes related to immune function that show strong signatures of positive selection around the supposed bottleneck period, potentially indicating response to novel pathogens. a pattern consistent with disease-driven population replacement. Similarly, genes associated with cognitive functions, language processing, and social bonding show evidence of selective sweeps during this period, suggesting competition may have favored enhanced social intelligence and cooperation. Traits that define modern humans. This competitive replacement theory ranks 610 on our evidence meter, equal to Toba. Its strength lies in better explaining the selective patterns in human genetics. While acknowledging that our ancestors faced existential challenges, though from each other rather than nature, the third alternative is the founder effect theory. This proposes that the apparent bottleneck reflects not global population collapse, but the demographics of human dispersal. As small groups of pioneers left Africa to colonize the world. When a small population separates from a larger one, it carries only a fraction of the original genetic diversity. This sampling creates a founder effect, reduced diversity in the new population, even if the original population remains large and diverse. If modern non-African populations descended primarily from a relatively small dispersal group, perhaps a few thousand individuals who left Africa around 70,000, 50,000 years ago, their limited genetic diversity would create the appearance of a global bottleneck. This theory aligns with archaeological evidence of human expansion out of Africa during this period, with the distribution patterns of genetic lineages across Eurasia, and with the greater genetic diversity consistently found in African populations. It also explains why genetic studies based primarily on non-African populations might detect a bottleneck, while studies including diverse African groups show a more complex picture. Different populations experience different demographic histories. The founder effect theory rates 810 on our evidence meter, the highest of our competing explanations. Its strength lies in better aligning with the geographical pattern of human genetic diversity, while requiring fewer assumptions about catastrophic events. Yet none of these theories alone fully explains all the evidence. Each addresses certain aspects while leaving others unresolved, suggesting the reality may be more complex than any single model. Perhaps the truth involves elements of all these theories. Multiple regional bottlenecks caused by different factors, environmental catastrophes in some areas, competition in others, founder effects during dispersal events, all contributing to humanity's current genetic profile. This combined model, what we might call the complex demographic history theory, would rate 910 on our evidence meter, not because it's definitively proven, but because it acknowledges the complexity evident in the data. It suggests our ancestors faced not one existential crisis, but many. Not a single near-extinction event, but a gauntlet of challenges. Environmental disasters, intergroup competition, disease outbreaks, founder effects during migrations, each shaping our genetic heritage. This perspective transforms how we understand human resilience, not as a response to one catastrophe, however severe, but as an adaptation to persistent existential threat, to a world where survival was never guaranteed. If correct, it suggests the traits that define humanity, our cognitive flexibility, technological innovation, and social cooperation, evolved not in response to a single event like Toba, but through constant selection under conditions of extreme environmental and social pressure. It suggests our ancestors faced and overcame multiple extinction-level threats. That human history is a story not of one narrow escape, but of many. That our existence today reflects not luck, but adaptations forged through repeated brushes with oblivion. This more complex narrative may lack the dramatic simplicity of the Toba catastrophe theory, but it better accounts for the full range of evidence, and it may ultimately tell us more about human resilience and vulnerability. Because if our species has repeatedly faced and overcome existential threats, if our adaptations reflect responses to multiple crisis points rather than just one, then we may be better equipped for future challenges than we realize. But before we accept this more complex model, we must consider the latest scientific evidence. Revolutionary new techniques are providing unprecedented insights into our genetic past and revealing paradoxes that challenge all existing theories. Chapter 9. New Science and Paradoxes. Recent scientific breakthroughs have transformed our understanding of human evolution. Ancient DNA recovery, improved genetic sequencing, advanced computational modeling. Together, these technologies reveal our past with unprecedented clarity. Ancient DNA in particular has revolutionized the field. We can now extract and analyze genetic material from specimens tens of thousands of years old, directly sampling the genomes of ancient populations rather than inferring them from modern ones. This gives us a genetic time machine, a way to directly observe changes in human DNA over time, to identify bottlenecks, expansions, adaptations, and migrations as they occurred, rather than reconstructing them from their distant echoes in modern genomes. And what this new science reveals is both clarifying and confounding, supporting elements of all theories we've discussed while challenging each one, creating new paradoxes even as it resolves old ones. The most significant finding comes from a 2022 study analyzing genomes from across Africa, spanning the past 20,000 years. This research identified multiple regional bottlenecks at different times, but none corresponding exactly to the Toba timeframe. Instead, it found evidence of complex population structure throughout Africa. Different groups experiencing different demographic histories, some expanding while others contracted, some mixing with others while some remained isolated. This directly challenges the simple Toba bottleneck narrative, but it also challenges the alternatives we've discussed, suggesting a more complex reality than any existing model fully captures. Similarly, analysis of ancient DNA from Eurasia reveals a pattern of repeated population turnovers, groups expanding into new territories, then being replaced by others, creating a palimpsest of genetic heritage more complex than previously imagined. For instance, the first humans in Europe were replaced by a different population around 40,000 years ago, who were themselves largely replaced during the last glacial maximum around 25,000 years ago, who were then partly replaced by farmers arriving 8,000 years ago. This pattern of replacement creates a paradox for our bottleneck theories. If populations repeatedly expanded and collapsed throughout prehistory, how do we identify which contractions reflect global catastrophes versus local replacements? The genetic evidence also reveals surprising diversity in ancient populations. Early human groups were not the homogeneous bands we once imagined, but complex societies with connections spanning vast distances, and genetic diversity sometimes exceeding modern populations. For example, hunter-gatherers in Europe before the arrival of agriculture show greater genetic diversity than modern Europeans, challenging the narrative of ever-narrowing diversity due to bottlenecks, suggesting instead that diversity has fluctuated over time. Ancient DNA has also revealed extensive interbreeding between different human populations, not just with Neanderthals and Denisovans, but between diverse groups of Homo sapiens, creating a complex web of genetic exchange rather than a simple tree. This complicates how we interpret evidence of bottlenecks. What appears as reduced diversity might instead reflect merged lineages. What seems like population contraction might indicate absorption of one group into another. Advanced climate modeling creates another paradox. While confirming Toba's eruption was indeed massive, these models suggest its global cooling effect was less severe and shorter-lived than previously thought, perhaps lasting years rather than decades. These models indicate the eruption would have caused significant cooling in the northern hemisphere, but much less impact in the southern hemisphere, with tropical regions particularly buffered against temperature changes. This geographical pattern aligns suspiciously well with where humans appear to have survived in greatest numbers, suggesting our distribution may have protected us regardless of the eruption's severity, a form of geographical resilience rather than adaptational miracle. Yet paradoxically, the same climate models show other events, not previously considered, that may have had equal or greater impact on human populations. Heinrich events, massive iceberg discharges; Dansgaard-Oeschger events, rapid warming periods; Bond events, cooling cycles. These climate fluctuations created rapid changes in temperature and precipitation patterns, transforming habitable regions into wastelands overnight, forcing migrations, adaptations, or extinctions, potentially causing multiple bottlenecks throughout prehistory. Archaeological evidence creates further paradoxes. While some sites show disruption around the Toba timeframe, others show continuity, and still others reveal technological innovations emerging precisely when populations should have been struggling for basic survival. For instance, sites in South Africa show the first evidence of heat treatment of stone tools, a sophisticated technological innovation appearing around the time of the supposed bottleneck, when survival pressures should have focused attention on immediate needs rather than experimentation. Similarly, symbolic behavior, ochre use, shell beads, geometric engravings, appears consistently through this period. Without the interruption, we would expect from a civilization-threatening catastrophe, suggesting either remarkable resilience or less severe impact than proposed. The most significant paradox emerges from genomic studies of mutation rates and genetic diversity. These suggest human effective population size has never dropped below approximately 10,000 individuals, significantly larger than the 1,000-2,000 often cited for the Toba bottleneck. Yet other genetic analyses clearly show evidence of population contractions, selective sweeps where beneficial mutations spread rapidly, founder effects where diversity narrows, patterns consistent with some form of bottleneck or bottlenecks. How do we resolve these contradictions? Perhaps the answer lies in population structure rather than size. Not how many humans existed, but how they were organized. Not total numbers, but patterns of connection and isolation. Recent modeling suggests a meta-population structure, interconnected but semi-isolated groups, can create genetic signatures resembling bottlenecks even when total population remains stable, if connectivity between groups fluctuates over time. In such a structure, climate deterioration might not cause global population collapse, but rather fragment previously connected populations into isolated refugia, creating genetic divisions that later affect diversity when populations reconnect. This structured metapopulation theory ranks 910 on our evidence meter. It elegantly explains the paradoxical genetic evidence, while accommodating the archaeological and climatic data, without requiring near-extinction scenarios. The latest ancient DNA studies provide compelling support for this model, revealing that human populations have repeatedly fragmented, isolated, reconnected, and merged throughout prehistory, creating a complex genetic history not captured by simpler models. For example, genetic evidence now suggests at least 3 major out-of-Africa dispersals, one approximately 120,000 years ago, another around 70,000, 50,000 years ago, and a third around 50,000, 40,000 years ago, each contributing differently to modern populations. This repeated pattern of dispersal, isolation, and reconnection creates exactly the genetic signature we observe. Reduced diversity in some lineages, but not others. Apparent bottlenecks at different times in different populations. Complex patterns of relatedness between groups. The most recent breakthrough comes from ancient environmental DNA, genetic material recovered not from fossils, but from sediments. This revolutionary technique allows us to reconstruct entire ecosystems through time, to observe how all life, not just humans, responded to events like Toba. These studies reveal something remarkable. Many plant and animal species show no evidence of population collapse following the Toba eruption. No genetic bottlenecks corresponding to the event. No major ecosystem restructuring beyond normal climate-driven changes. This creates perhaps the greatest paradox of all. If Toba created a global catastrophe severe enough to nearly eliminate humans, why don't other species show similar genetic evidence of near extinction? Why would we alone have suffered so dramatically? One possibility is that humans were uniquely vulnerable. Perhaps our population was already small and fragmented. Perhaps we occupied particularly vulnerable ecosystems. Perhaps our specific dietary needs made us especially susceptible to ecological disruption. But a more likely explanation is that the human genetic pattern reflects our unique population dynamics. our unusual combination of mobility, technological adaptation, and social structure, creating bottleneck-like signatures through mechanisms other than near extinction. This brings us to our final paradox, the timing of human cognitive and cultural evolution, the creative explosion that appears in the archaeological record after the supposed bottleneck, the rapid development of art, advanced technology, and symbolic expression. Did this cultural revolution result from the bottleneck, as some have suggested? Was it driven by the extreme selection pressure of near extinction? Or was it already underway, with the timing coincidental rather than causal? Recent discoveries suggest the latter. Sites in Africa and Asia show evidence of symbolic thinking, advanced technology, and artistic expression well before the Toba eruption, indicating a gradual development rather than sudden emergence. The apparent explosion may reflect preservation bias and research focus. We have more sites, better preservation, and greater research interest in more recent periods, creating the illusion of sudden advancement when the reality was continuous development. These paradoxes and new discoveries don't invalidate the Toba catastrophe theory entirely, but they do transform how we understand it, shifting our perspective from a single near-extinction event to a more complex pattern of challenges and adaptations. As our evidence meter indicates at 8 to 10, we've moved from the debated range into decoded, not because we've confirmed one theory over others, but because we've decoded the complexity of what actually happened, a reality more nuanced than any simple narrative. And this complexity itself may be the most significant revelation, for it suggests our existence today reflects not one narrow escape, but a long history of challenges overcome, not luck, but adaptation, not miracle, but process. With this understanding, we're ready to confront the central mystery, to reveal what really happened approximately 70,000 years ago, and what it means for humanity's past, present, and future. Chapter 10. The Big Reveal. Throughout this investigation, we've pursued a singular question. Did humanity nearly go extinct around 70,000 years ago? Did the Toba supervolcanic eruption push our species to the brink of oblivion? Did our entire future hang by the thread of a few thousand survivors? The answer, revealed by the latest scientific evidence, is both simpler and more profound than the dramatic narrative of the Toba catastrophe theory. It transforms how we understand not just this particular event, but human evolution as a whole. Here is the revelation. Humanity didn't nearly go extinct once. We've nearly gone extinct repeatedly. Our entire evolutionary history has been a series of expansions and contractions, advancements and retreats, near extinctions and recoveries. The genetic bottlenecks we detect aren't anomalies, they're the pattern. Not exceptional events, but the normal condition of a species evolving under constantly changing environmental and competitive pressures. The rule rather than the exception. Our modern perspective, shaped by population growth and technological buffering, sees stability as normal and catastrophe as exceptional. But for most of human existence, the opposite was true. Precarity was the baseline, stability the exception. This is why our genome shows evidence of multiple bottlenecks, why different populations show different patterns of contraction and expansion, why our genetic diversity fluctuates through time rather than narrowing in a single dramatic event. Toba was indeed a significant event. It did affect human populations, particularly in South and Southeast Asia. It did contribute to one of many bottlenecks in our evolutionary history, but it was neither unique nor solely responsible for shaping our genetic heritage. The real story is far more remarkable. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors faced a gauntlet of existential challenges: abrupt climate changes, competition with other hominins, novel predators and pathogens, resource scarcity, geological disasters. Each crisis selected for specific adaptations. Climate fluctuations favored physiological and technological flexibility. Competition with other groups selected for enhanced cognition and cooperation. Resource scarcity drove innovation and efficient exploitation strategies. This constant pressure, this evolutionary gauntlet, forged the traits that define humanity. Not in a single catastrophic crucible like Toba, but through persistent selection across countless generations, through repeated brushes with extinction. Our capacity for language, abstract thought, technological innovation and social cooperation, our ability to adapt to diverse environments, respond to novel challenges, and transmit solutions culturally. These aren't merely beneficial traits, but survival mechanisms. They evolved specifically because our ancestors repeatedly faced extinction-level threats, because those without these capacities did go extinct, because only those with enhanced cognitive and social abilities survived to become our ancestors. This perspective transforms how we understand human resilience. It's not that we overcame one catastrophe through luck or miracle, but that we evolved specifically to overcome catastrophes, that our defining characteristics are adaptations to existential threat. The evidence for this more complex narrative is overwhelming. Our evidence meter reaches 1010, fully decoded. The genetic data, archaeological record, climate reconstructions, and comparative biology all point to this pattern of repeated challenge and adaptation. Recent genomic studies have identified multiple selective sweeps throughout human evolution, periods when beneficial mutations spread rapidly through the population, often clustering around genes related to immune function, brain development, and metabolic efficiency. These selective sweeps frequently coincide with periods of climate instability, ecological change, or population movement, suggesting adaptation in response to specific challenges, a genetic record of crises overcome. Similarly, the archaeological record shows technological innovations emerging often during periods of environmental stress, new hunting techniques during prey scarcity, new shelter designs during climate deterioration, new social organizations during resource competition. This pattern of innovation under pressure continues throughout human prehistory and history, from the first stone tools to modern digital technology. Necessity as the mother of invention, threat as the driver of adaptation. When we compare human evolution to that of other hominins, this pattern becomes even clearer. Neanderthals, despite their larger brains and robust physiology, showed less technological innovation over time, less cultural transmission, less adaptive flexibility. Their extinction approximately 40,000 years ago, after surviving for hundreds of thousands of years, likely reflects not inferiority, but different adaptive strategies. Specialization versus flexibility. Physiological adaptation versus technological buffering. Homo sapiens survived not because we were stronger or smarter in absolute terms, but because our particular cognitive and social adaptations provided better responses to unpredictable, rapid-onset threats. Better strategies for navigating existential challenges. This insight resolves the paradoxes we encountered earlier. Why different populations show different bottleneck patterns. Why some regions show continuity through supposed catastrophes, while others show disruption. Why our creative capacities emerged gradually rather than suddenly. It explains why we see evidence of symbolic thinking and technological innovation precisely when populations were supposedly struggling for basic survival. Because innovation itself was the survival strategy. Creativity, the adaptation to crisis. It explains why human genetic diversity shows complex patterns rather than simple reduction. Because our demographic history reflects not one bottleneck, but many. Not global catastrophe, but regional challenges. Not uniform impact, but differential selection. Most significantly, it explains why human populations repeatedly recovered and expanded after contractions, not through blind luck, but through adaptations specifically evolved to enable recovery from population crashes. Resilience mechanisms built into our biology and culture. These mechanisms include physiological adaptations like dietary flexibility and efficient metabolism, cognitive adaptations like pattern recognition and problem solving, social adaptations like cooperative child-rearing and knowledge transmission, all maximizing survival odds under stress. They include cultural adaptations like food preservation techniques, seasonal migration patterns, and risk-spreading subsistence strategies. Technologies from clothing to controlled fire to weapons, each providing buffers against specific environmental threats. And they include social structures promoting information sharing, resource pooling, and cooperative defense. From kinship systems to trade networks to symbolic identities. Creating resilience through connection, survival through solidarity. Together, these adaptations transformed humans from just another vulnerable primate into perhaps the most resilient large mammal on Earth. A species capable of surviving in environments from the Arctic to the Sahara, of recovering from population crashes that would eliminate most species. This is the true revelation of our investigation. Humanity's defining characteristic isn't intelligence alone, but adaptive resilience. Not just our capacity to think, but our ability to overcome not just what we know, but how we respond to what we don't know. We are not merely the descendants of those lucky enough to survive catastrophe. We are the descendants of those who evolved specifically to survive catastrophes, who developed biological and cultural adaptations precisely for overcoming existential threats. This perspective transforms how we understand not just our past, but our present and future. For if our species evolved specifically to overcome extinction-level threats, then we may possess resources for facing modern challenges that we haven't fully recognized. The climate crisis, biodiversity collapse, nuclear proliferation, and emerging pathogens are unprecedented in their specifics, but not in their fundamental nature as existential threats. They are modern versions of the very pressures that shaped humanity. Our ancestors couldn't have imagined these particular challenges, but they bequeathed us the cognitive, social, and cultural adaptations for responding to existential threat itself. Adaptations that may prove crucial for our continued survival. This doesn't guarantee our future. No adaptation ensures perpetual survival, but it does suggest we shouldn't underestimate our collective capacity for innovation under pressure, for cooperation in crisis, for transformation when survival demands it. Because that capacity isn't incidental to human nature, it is human nature. Not just another trait, but the defining characteristic of our species, the adaptation of adaptability itself. The meta-strategy that has allowed us to survive when other hominins perished. This is the ultimate meaning of humanity's narrow escape, or rather escapes. Not that we got lucky once, but that we evolved to make our own luck. Not that we survived by chance, but that we survived by becoming a species specialized for survival itself. In this light, the Toba catastrophe theory isn't wrong so much as incomplete. It correctly identified one significant challenge our ancestors faced, but missed the broader pattern of which Toba was merely one instance, the constant dance with extinction that defined our evolution. And perhaps most importantly, it missed the most remarkable aspect of human history. Not that we nearly went extinct, but that we repeatedly faced extinction and overcame it. Not our vulnerability, but our resilience. Not how close we came to disappearing, but how we survived. This more complex understanding doesn't diminish the drama of our evolutionary story. It enhances it. It reveals humanity's history as not one narrow escape, but many. Not one miracle, but a process of adaptation. Not luck, but strategy. Not chance, but response. It suggests that what appears to be humanity's greatest weakness, our dependence on complex technology and social systems rather than innate biological adaptations, may actually be our greatest strength. The very trait that has allowed us to survive when other species haven't. As we face an uncertain future full of unprecedented challenges, this perspective offers neither complacency nor despair, but rather a recognition of our evolved capacity for overcoming existential threats, and the responsibility to use that capacity wisely. For we are not merely the beneficiaries of our ancestors' resilience, we are its custodians, carrying forward the adaptations they developed at such cost, responsible for preserving and enhancing humanity's capacity for survival, for those who will come after us. This, ultimately, is what the story of Toba and humanity's other narrow escapes reveals, not just where we came from, but who we are. Not just how we survived, but why. Not just our past, but our potential. As we conclude our investigation into humanity's narrow escape, we're left not with a single dramatic moment of near extinction, but with a profound understanding of human nature itself. As forged through repeated existential challenges across hundreds of thousands of years, the Toba catastrophe, while significant, was merely one chapter in humanity's long dance with extinction. One test among many that shaped our cognitive, social, and cultural evolution. One instance of the pattern that defined our emergence as a species. This understanding transforms how we might approach modern existential threats, not as unprecedented challenges for which we're unprepared, but as the very type of selective pressure under which our most distinctive adaptations evolved. Our capacity for scientific innovation, global cooperation, and cultural transformation aren't incidental to human nature, but central to it. They're the very adaptations that allowed our ancestors to survive when extinction seemed certain, the traits that might save us again. Yet this perspective offers no guarantee of our continued existence, for the same evolutionary process that produced our remarkable resilience also produced the Neanderthals, who survived for hundreds of thousands of years before eventually disappearing. Every adaptation has limits, every strategy can be overwhelmed by sufficient challenge, every species eventually faces threats beyond its capacity to overcome. The fossil record is filled with lineages that thrived for millions of years before meeting extinction. The open question, the mystery that remains unresolved, is whether humanity's unique adaptation of adaptability itself, our capacity to transform our relationship with our environment through technology and cooperation, represents a fundamental breakthrough in evolution's logic. Have we transcended the limitations that doomed other species, or merely postponed our inevitable extinction? Has our cultural evolution created a new form of resilience, or new vulnerabilities that will prove our undoing? The answer lies not in our past, but in our future. Not in what our ancestors did, but in what we choose to do now. Not in the threats they overcame, but in how we respond to those we face. Not in their resilience, but in ours. For we are not merely the products of evolution, but its agents, not just adapted, but adapting, not just shaped by selective pressure, but increasingly determining those pressures ourselves, creating our own evolutionary future. This is both our greatest responsibility and our greatest opportunity, to consciously direct the adaptation process that has unconsciously shaped us, to use our understanding of our evolutionary past to secure our evolutionary future, to become the authors of our continuing story. If you found this journey through humanity's narrow escapes illuminating, consider subscribing for more explorations of our species' remarkable past and uncertain future. For in understanding where we came from and how close we came to never existing at all, we might just discover who we truly are and what we might yet become.